100 days till Brexit, and the UK government still can't agree on how to leave the European Union. Should the British public be given a second referendum? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the push for a people's vote. Well, it was former British Prime Minister Harold Wilson who said, "A week is a long time in politics." But for Theresa May, every day over the past month must have felt like an eternity. After calling off a parliamentary vote on her Brexit deal, May faced a leadership challenge. She survived, but was forced to go back to Brussels last week to try to eke out more concessions on her agreement. But Europe didn't budge. Now her cabinet is preparing for a no deal, which some argue could be catastrophic for the UK's economy. So where does she go from here? A parliamentary vote on the Brexit withdrawal agreement is set to take place in just under a month. So could May change Parliament's mind before then? Right now, that doesn't seem likely, and all sides seem to be preparing for the worst. But calls for a second referendum are getting louder by the day. Many are saying it's time for the people to make the call now that they know what Brexit could mean. Shoaib Hassan reports.
Just 100 days to go and no consensus. Britain's exit from the EU is set for the end of March, but the British public and its politicians are so divided. One side sees Brexit as a catastrophe and the other as an opportunity, and no one seems in the mood to make concessions. Still, Prime Minister Theresa May says her government's working to ensure a smooth transition.
Negotiations like this are always tough, there are always difficult times, and as you get close to the very end, then that can get even more difficult because you're absolutely sorting out the last details of something. But this is what drives me to carry on doing this and making sure we deliver, is that this is what's right for the British people.
But the clock is ticking, and there has been little progress in getting a Brexit plan through the British Parliament. So both the EU and May's government have started to prepare for a no-deal Brexit. Many multinational companies headquartered in London argue a departure without a deal would be catastrophic for the British economy. And pressure for a second Brexit referendum is growing from an opposition that wants the UK to remain in the EU.
Asking us to vote for a deal when so many crucial issues, notably security, are not yet clear. Asking us to vote for a deal which could endanger not just our economy, but our security going forward. The more you examine this deal, the more it becomes clear that this House cannot vote to support it.
May withdrew a vote planned on her Brexit deal last week and has now moved it to the third week of January. But approval from Parliament still remains unlikely, as even members of her own party have joined the criticism.
I resigned because I thought this is the biggest vote I'll probably ever vote in my political career. It is for each member in this House to decide what they do. But for me, the national interest is not served by voting for the government's motion.
Public support for a second referendum appears to be rising, according to polls in the national press. Senior politicians and even former Prime Minister Tony Blair have joined in the call for another vote by the public. In the meantime, May is battling to maintain her authority as Prime Minister after surviving a recent vote of no confidence. She and her cabinet have dismissed the idea of another referendum, saying it would be a disaster for British democracy. So, will May's government be able to secure a deal to leave the EU? And is a second referendum really undemocratic, even if Britons have changed their minds? Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Let's bring in our panel now, and from London, we have Mike Galsworthy. He is the co-founder of Scientists for the EU, a campaign by British scientists to keep the UK in the European Union, and he's also calling for a second referendum. And from Brussels, Stephen Wolfe. He is a member of the European Parliament for North West England and a former senior member of UKIP, the UK Independence Party. Thanks both so much for joining us. Mike, let me start with you. I mean, in complaints, in spite of complaints, I should say, that a second referendum would be divisive and undemocratic. You say it's inevitable and even fair. Why?
Yeah, well, whether you support a second referendum or not, the mechanics of the whole process are dragging us there. What you've got in Parliament is at least a three-way split, which means nothing is going to get a majority vote. However, if you've got a three-way split in the public, you can have a first choice and second choice, and something can get through. So you can actually, with the public vote, break a deadlock that you can't mechanically break in Parliament.
But a three-way vote in the public, would that lead to a runoff vote of the two top options? I mean, how would you come out with a decisive outcome?
No, you pick a first choice and a second choice, or something like that. I mean, all of this is still to be decided, but I think it's fairly clear that Parliament is stuck, and if you want more time on it, and if you want more options on it, then you bring it back and sort of redesign together with the public what your basic choices are. I think that is only fair and reasonable, and like I just said, it really is the only pragmatic way to break the deadlock that we've got at the moment.
Okay, what about the option, though, Mike, let me ask you this, that some are calling for, and that they know Parliament will reject this deal. So once it's been rejected by the public's chosen representatives, that leaves the British public with the option to crash out of the EU with no deal that the government is now preparing for, or to stay in the EU with the same conditions. Would it be fair, in your opinion, to put that decision to the public?
Yes, absolutely. So you're saying if the Parliament reject this deal, then that gives the public the options. That's wrong. If the government reject this deal, then the government is on a path to crash out, which they will actually reject at the last moment because we know what they think. So we are all sleepwalking into Theresa May's deal, which very, very few people are happy with. And if we do want those other options, including crash out or including remain, if we actually want them on the table, then the only way for us to have that option is for Parliament to say, right, the public can have a look at these options again.
Okay, so Stephen Wolfe, Mike Galsworthy makes it sound pretty logical. So what's the problem?
Well, first of all, the problem is it is totally anti-democratic, notwithstanding what Michael says, is this would be a third referendum on our membership of the European Union. We had one in 1975. The Remainers lost in 2016. And the essential element about democracy is that when a vote on a decision is to be made by the public through an election, then it is incumbent upon those politicians, once they heard from the people, to actually enact that decision. Now, the decision of the people of Britain was to leave the European Union. And what we have seen since that referendum, that momentous referendum, is that those parliamentarians, of which there was a lot of them anyway, the vast majority of them, who never wanted to leave the European Union, have made sure that it's become increasingly difficult for them not to listen. And that is the danger of democracy. I call it the four horsemen of democratic destruction. You're going to cause disruption, dismay, disillusionment, and there is a massive danger in our society that people will look back at this and say, you're never going to listen to us, why bother voting again?
Okay, but Stephen, I mean, you say the British public voted to leave the European Union, but 48.1% voted to stay. That is almost half the population, and many have complained that the options on this referendum were not clear and therefore not fair. They did not know what Brexit meant. So they were voting for something that they didn't really understand the ramifications of. Now they will, if they go to a second referendum, they will have a clear idea of what Brexit actually means.
Well, not only is that sadly a very demeaning argument from those who are putting forward this view that the British public didn't understand what they wanted. That's insulting to the democracy.
It's not that they didn't understand what they wanted. They didn't understand what form Brexit would take because it had not been decided yet.
Well, what they did understand very clearly is that the European Union hasn't changed. All the problems that were connected with the European Union, whether it related to immigration, whether it related to the amount of money that we put in every year, whether it relates to the lack of control over the regulation that impacts our lives, still goes on. What they have clearly seen now is how involved the European Union is in every aspect of our lives, and how many of our politicians didn't even have a clue what regulations, rules and laws were being impacted on. That was very embarrassing for the MPs in the House of Commons, and it's made it very clear that it is a need to bring back our democracy into the UK. Secondly, everybody understood that it meant leaving the customs union and single market. After all, the government sent a £9 million document to houses across the country that explained exactly that. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Prime Minister, the national debates said that we would leave the customs union and single market. So to say that the British public didn't understand what it meant, as I say, not yourself, but those who are proposing this argument, is insulting their integrity and their intelligence. And what is to say now that we know any better what the future of the European Union is? We don't. What I do know is that the European Union is preparing for no deal behind me today.
Right. I just have to ask you one more point, Stephen. Michael, come back to you in just a second. But on this,
yeah, sure.
This complaint that calling a second referendum would be so undemocratic, let me ask you this. When Theresa May didn't have the parliamentary makeup she wanted to build her Brexit agenda, she called for a snap election, and she forced voters to vote again for representatives they'd already chosen. Why is that democratic? And then a second referendum wouldn't be?
Well, actually, this strengthens the argument for those who said that we should carry on with the Brexit deal that we wanted. The manifestos of both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, plus a number of other parties, said that we should leave the customs union, the single market, and have the Brexit that was in the referendum. The vast majority of those MPs who were returned to Parliament did so on those manifestos. That was a promise to the British people. Now, what you see, whether it's Anna Soubry, Sarah Wollaston, Heidi Allen, Nick Bowles today, all these Conservative MPs who are saying that if we don't have a third referendum and effectively stay in the EU, they're going against their own manifesto, they're going against their own government, and they're going against the democratic will of the people who voted in that referendum and that general election.
Okay, Mike, I'd like to get your take on that.
Yeah, I think what Stephen says, a lot of it is very, very reasonable. And there is a fundamental principle of democracy that if you vote for something, then it should be done. However, the question now is, do most of the public actually agree with that? Do most of the public think that they should be, at this stage, absolutely neutered from having any say over it, and you can have a type of Brexit that no one wants? That's the key question. So it's perfectly reasonable of Stephen if most people agree with him. If most people don't, then basically we're getting a solution rammed on us that does not have the public support. So here's a question, which is, Stephen says most people voted to leave the single market and customs union, and we can have debates about that over who said what and what the polls actually showed. But then the question is, this Brexit now, which is on the table, does he support it? Theresa May's deal, does he support it? Because I don't, and I'm suspecting he doesn't, but that is exactly what we are going to swallow right now, because Theresa May is going to push it up to the wire. Parliament will not support a crash out, so they will flip back onto her deal at the last stage. That is the box, the sort of naughty step, the sort of quarantine that we are going to get pushed into, and anyone who wants a different solution should be asking for a people's vote, a public say, in order to open up those other options. For me, I'd like Remain. I'm sure for him, he'd like some kind of immediate leave, crash out, whatever. But we're both going to get screwed. Neither of us are going to get our preferred options unless we jump away from Theresa May's deal. And this is the only way to do it.
And Stephen, you don't like Theresa May's deal?
No, absolutely not, because Theresa May's deal is not leaving the European Union. It actually is keeping us in the European Union.
But that's what we're going to get unless we can collectively pivot away from that.
Well, what I would suggest is, in this particular scenario, is that Theresa May has to recognise that in trying to help those in the cabinet who supported Remain and the civil service behind her and the large corporations, she's conjured up a deal that in the end the Remainers will see is keeping them in, except that we're not having the Commission, the Council and the Parliament. And all of that is essentially staying in the EU. I don't want that. I'd much rather have the WTO deal that is on the table and that was mentioned during the referendum. And a WTO deal that today the European Commission has said very clearly, we've just picked up the press release from them, that says this will not be a cliff edge for the European Union or Britain. Indeed, in financial services, there will be no problems in relation to the EU or the way that the Council will work, that a lot of the work has already been done. So a lot of the scare stories that have been put out there about a cliff edge, a damage, slipping into non-entity is not going to happen. The EU and the UK will just carry on trading. There will be difficulties, all sides admitted that, but it will not be the cliff edge or disaster And that has been stated today by the EU themselves.
Okay. If I can, Mike, I'd like to go back to you with the issue of the democratic nature of the referendum in itself, first or second referendum. There were questions about who was and is allowed to vote in these referendums. There were, for example, over 1 million Britons living outside the UK, and because they lived outside the UK for over a decade, they were not allowed to participate, but people in the UK on temporary work permits that are not UK citizens were allowed to participate because they are temporarily paying taxes. With so much finality to this vote, this isn't voting for local parliamentarians that you can vote out in 4 years' time. How is it democratic to allow those conditions for the first referendum and again for a second, if it happens?
Yeah, so there were a lot of EU citizens in our country who were disenfranchised. You know, the phrase, no taxation without representation, well, they were denied that. And we actually have Brits living abroad that were also denied that. This was all part of the 2016 referendum. David Cameron thought he was really clever because during the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, he let the opposing side define their demographics that were going to vote on it so that they could have no issue with him. He thought that he would repeat that trick in 2016 and disenfranchise a lot of people. Now, lots of us have issues with that, but the question now is, are the public happy with where we're going? If they're happy that we've had people disenfranchised and they're happy with the deal, then fine, you know, we've got no case to make. But looking at it now, no one is happy. I'm not happy, the Remainers aren't happy, the youth aren't happy, even those like Stephen himself that want this WTO deal which doesn't exist, or at least coming out on some kind of Canada deal or whatever, they're not going to get that because Parliament won't allow it. We are being pushed into Theresa May's deal. And the only way to get other options, if the public are unhappy with Theresa May's deal, as they are, is to reject that bear trap and step back and throw it back out for the nationwide discussion again, with a little bit more time, which is what the EU will allow us.
Okay.
And then, you know, Stephen can make the case for his deal in that circumstance, and that can be on the ballot paper with all full glorious detail about what the WTO will do for us that the EU never could, and so forth and so on.
Okay.
But he's not going to get that unless he joins us.
Stephen, I'd like to ask you, I want to get your take as well on those British citizens that feel they were disenfranchised in the first vote in the referendum and also would likely be in a second vote. What about those 1.2 million people, so many of whom could not vote because they've lived outside the UK for more than a decade?
Okay, I have to correct you on that number of the 1.2 million people. The EU Commission and ourselves and the research I've undertaken shows it's just less than 900,000 of that, and 260,000 of them were related to Ireland themselves. So the actual numbers suggested are much lower in the EU. Globally, it is much bigger.
It's still
but the
thousands of
principle
voters
at stake here, and I've always argued this for a long... It is still thousands of voters, but I still argued very clearly, if you have made a decision to permanently live abroad in a different country,
but they're not permanently living abroad. They may come back to the UK at any point.
Yes, they may come back, they may not, they may die, they may decide to move to a different country. But
just
what
like
you're
any
trying
other
to say
Briton
is
living
that
in the
people
UK
who
now
leave this country, they should not have the right, and international law in many ways respects this from the UN downwards, is that those people make their decision to move away. Why is it that somebody who lives abroad, living in a different country, has more influence by having a vote than somebody who actually has to pay their taxes in the UK?
Who's saying they have more influence? They have the same influence because they are a citizen. And if they're living abroad, for example, working for a UK company for over a decade, they don't have the right to participate in the future of their country?
Exactly. They're our own citizens,
but they also
and we're
have
cutting away
rights
their
to
rights.
But they have citizenship. Some people have lived in 20 or 30 years abroad. Are we to say that they should impact the lives of somebody who lives in a council estate in Manchester, where I was grown up, and influence the decisions of government on those people who still have no choice to go and live abroad like themselves in Canada or Australia or Germany or France or any of those countries? I think there's a basic unfairness.
But it should be the other way
on
around.
those people who think that they should have the automatic right.
Go ahead, Mike.
I think there is a very clear...
But I was asking...
Sorry,
if it should be the other way round. You were saying that people who are UK citizens who live abroad shouldn't be able to influence the lives of people in a council estate in the UK, but people in a council estate in the UK should be able to undercut and undermine their fellow British citizens who live abroad. I think it should be equitable myself.
I'll tell you what, both of you, we just have a few minutes left.
On this particular point, Mike, you and I are going to disagree on this.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I think there's much that I've agreed
but
with.
But hopefully we can agree that Theresa May's deal is bad for all of us.
I don't.
And you do agree on that. Both of you believe that it is a bad deal, Theresa May's deal that's on the table. Fair enough. We just have a few minutes left.
Quarantine for our country. We can all agree that. Yeah.
So let's go back to the likelihood of a second referendum. I mean, part of the momentum behind this second referendum comes down to this People's Vote campaign. It is gaining momentum. We're seeing even star power behind it now. And according to some, more and more logic. I mean, Mike, what do you make of the People's Campaign itself? Do you think it will strengthen as we go forward in the coming weeks?
Yeah, well, I run two campaigns, Scientists for EU and NHS Against Brexit, and those two are founders of the People's Vote umbrella of campaigns. We've all been working on this together. So it became clear to us earlier this year that essentially the Parliament would likely get stuck in gridlock, and then we just wanted to say, if that happens, then let's build a route out for the people to be able to either pick their option or reject the lot wholesale and say, thanks for the experiment, but we don't want it anymore. And we believe that is fundamentally democratically fair. And it is gaining momentum at the moment for all of those reasons. But again, I mean, it comes down to the interaction between the citizen and their parliamentarians. Our citizens in all these constituencies are pestering their MPs for this. They're writing to them. They're saying, come on, we've sat around watching this for 2.5 years now. We do want to say, we do want input. Let us have this vote. And that is why the whole thing is gathering momentum, because they see the farce in Parliament and they at least want to have some kind of say in it at this stage.
Stephen, final words on the People's Vote campaign?
Look, I fully appreciate that those people who want to remain in the EU are getting behind this people's vote. This isn't about a democratic view for themselves. It's trying to overturn the original referendum. And what is not answered by the people in the People's Vote referendum is this. How do you explain to those people who haven't seen their Brexit happen go on in the future? How do you explain to them that their view has been ignored? And secondly, you don't see a clamouring of Leave voters seeking a return of a third referendum. It is only those people who didn't win the first time round or the second time around in this referendum that want this. And the whole reason behind it is to stop Brexit. It isn't about democracy, and that is why I'm vehemently opposed to it.
Okay. Mike Goldsworthy and Stephen Wolfe. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you both so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. Still to come, slave labor in Hungary. Protests erupt in Budapest as the opposition unites over controversial new labor laws. And we speak to a woman who almost lost her life fighting for women's rights in Afghanistan. From the left to the right, Hungary's opposition has, at least temporarily, united. It's all over changes to the country's labor legislation. Thousands have been braving freezing temperatures to protest the so-called slave law that allows employers to not only force employees to work overtime, but also wait up to 3 years to get paid for it. Viktor Orban's government has defended the legislation and blamed the protests on the Prime Minister's arch-nemesis, Hungarian-born billionaire George Soros. He also blames the international media for exaggerating the demonstrations. But people remain on the streets. So, is this resistance an actual threat to Orban and his government? Natalie Pohonen takes a look.
It's below freezing in Budapest, but it hasn't stopped thousands of Hungarians from marching in protest against the government. In a bid to ease a severe labour shortage, Parliament passed what's being called the slave law. It raises the amount of overtime companies can demand from 250 hours a year to 400 hours a year. Employers can also withhold payment for that work for for up to 3 years.
Nem tárgyalnak senkivel.
They don't negotiate with anyone. They do what they think. They actually steal everything. It is intolerable. It cannot go on anymore.
Prime Minister Viktor Orban's government has been the subject of protests before. But there's something different this time. Because alongside the students and workers and pensioners on the streets, there are now politicians from across the ideological spectrum. Opposition groups have united to condemn the ruling Fidesz party and its grip on power.
We'll not only be in the streets, not only on the internet, but we'll be in the workplace, at the roadblocks. We'll be at every point that will hurt this regime, and so you will be there too.
The opposition wanted that message to spread through state media.
The parliament is a very dark and disgraceful place now. But if this media centre here, the Death Star of the empire, remains, then we won't be able to have order in this country. Because what I was talking about in the previous demonstration, the pills of fear that people are being fed every day, are made here.
So lawmakers held a sit-in at the state broadcaster, MTVA. Their mission, to read out a petition against the government on the air. They were only partly successful. Their message wasn't broadcast in Hungarian, but it did make MTVA's English language news.
And welcome to Hungary Reports.
However, the head of security at public television pointed out to them that they did not have the right to enter studios and the newsroom.
Hungary's Secretary of State for International Communications, Zoltán Kovács, has downplayed the protests.
Brace yourselves for a new kind of democracy, one born of a carefully managed revolution by remote control. The protesters, pawns in a larger political game, pretend that they're the majority in the face of a 2/3 parliamentary majority and overwhelming voter support for the governing parties.
In this year's elections, Orbán campaigned on a nationalist platform, and voters returned him to office with a landslide victory. The governing coalition has an indisputable parliamentary mandate. So while these protests against Orbán are expected to continue, the Prime Minister remains in the ultimate position of power. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Budapest is Károly György. He is the International Secretary of the National Confederation of Hungarian Trade Unions. From New Haven, Connecticut, is former Yale professor and editor of the Hungarian Spectrum, Eva Balak. And from Knoxville, Tennessee, Jason Emmert, chairman of the Young Republicans National Federation. He also runs an international consulting firm. Thanks all so much for joining us. Eva, let me begin with you. Since you are Hungarian on the outside now, looking in, tell me if you think first that these protests were justified, and has the government's response been appropriate?
I think it was very much justified. When it comes to the government, I think they are trying to act as if all these demonstrations just didn't happen. They try to hide the fact. And since practically all the regional newspapers are in Fidesz's hands, they simply just don't report on what is going on in Budapest. But what now is happening, that things are quieted down in Budapest, but the dissatisfaction is showing up in the smaller cities across the country.
Okay. Jason, let me ask you, because I know you think these protests aren't representative of the wider Hungarian public and what you feel is the true popularity of this government. But I'd like you to comment on that, as well as the sense of unity, strangely enough, that has been formed among these protesters, given that they're politically, ideologically opposed, so many of them. You have the Greens, as well as far-right parties, out there on the streets together, protesting over this disagreement with the government that they have in common.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think anytime that you unite both the far right and the leftist parties, what that really means is the government is they want the government to have more power. And it's just not representative of what's been going on in Hungary for the last several years. We just had an election in Hungary in April. Over 50%, almost 50% of the people voted for Fidesz and KDNP. So there is a overwhelming support for this party. The minority parties are just that. They're in extreme minorities. And what this is a small but loud group of people that want more government control. And what the government is trying to do is empower the individual, which is the greatest and most protected minority that we should look out for.
Okay, Chiaroli, do you agree there? Are you just small but loud?
I would strongly disagree with Jason. First of all, I refer back to our representative opinion poll, which showed that there is 83% of the people rejecting this slave law, and the 81% of the people say that there is a higher level of vulnerability which this law creates. So I think finally what you see on the streets, here you have one single issue, which is to say the downgrading of workers' rights in this instance, which has an impact on everyone. You have 4.6 million working people in Hungary, which means it is quite a wide strata. I wouldn't say it's a minority. I fully reject this, and it has been used as an argument by the government. You hear the government spokesperson referring to minority group of people. No, it is not. We are surveying our members. We are going through to see how they really feel. And we are down at the workplaces. I know that one can say that unions are weak in Hungary, organization rate is rather low. This is true, but still we can bring our voice to the decision makers. The problem is that this law was passed without any real consultation, put through as an individual motion with the misuse of the parliamentary procedures, which the government, by the way, has used over the past 8 years. Some even call it as the kind of stealth legislation, going out of the official frames for partnership.
And Eva, I'm going to quote you. You've said actually the slave law was actually a spark that's now lit a fire against not just the law, but the government. I'm sure Jason would disagree, but tell me why you believe it's true.
Well, from the very beginning, they started not just talking about the slave law, but also about Orban, get the hell out of here, basically. They kept saying, filthy Fidesz. They want change. Now, it's true that at the moment, only mostly students went out. But if the trade unions are going to join, which they will, this can be a very powerful movement. Now, I would like to argue with Jason when he proudly announces what a huge majority Fidesz has in parliament. Now, that's true. It has 2/3 majority. But how was that achieved? Almost half the people voted against Fidesz, both from the right and from the left. And the electoral law, which Fidesz created without really consultation with any other party, is so tilted that a 48% or 49% vote was translated into almost 70% in parliament. So please, let's not argue about that.
Okay. Jason, I'll let you respond quickly before I go on to another point. Go ahead.
I think the absurdity of calling this a slave law is just totally patently false. It's not a slave law, and it is totally disingenuous to call it that. There is a parliamentary majority, and Not even the united opposition that everybody claims voted against this. Only 52 people in Parliament, less than 1/3, voted against this bill. So to say that there's some kind of uprising, this commonality between these two parties is just false. And what it is, it's a very small group of loud people who are making international news because there is a concerted effort against Prime Minister Orban and his government. And I think it's patently false to pass this off as some greater movement indicative of change in Hungary of a far left movement.
Kjaroli, go ahead.
Well, I highly admire Jason. I've followed a little bit what he's been doing until now in his life, and I wish great successes also. But please be realistic and go down to earth. First of all, if I might quote from the Declaration of Principles from 1983 of the International Democratic Union, where you are one of the leaders on national level, and Mr. Orban and a number of our governments are from this region, which says that being committed to advancing the social and political values on which democratic societies are founded, including right of free speech, organization, assembly, non-violent dissent, freedom to organize effective parliamentary opposition to government, right to free and independent media. I'm sorry, I'm just repeating it and I'm quoting it because exactly the opposite is happening in everyday life in Hungary by many people who see. You see how we, for example, Hungarian trade unions have practically no access to the public media. Public media which is fully financed by my and my colleagues' taxpayer money. Right. There is no free press if you don't have an access to it.
Okay.
So we can talk about a lot of things, and I'd like to come back to the point, to my, I would say, sandbox to play in, the world of labor. Since 2011, when the changes in the labor code happened, downgrading individual and collective rights. Now the different changes. The strike law, which practically makes impossible to have any lawful strike in the public sector. So you have really everyday reality, and you have, and one more point I'd like to bring.
Okay,
here.
but Kjaroli, we have very little time, and we need to give time to the other panelists as well. I mean, we understand you do have strong arguments to say that you believe the government is undermining the democracy and even the constitution of Hungary. And Jason, I mean, I know you'll fight those arguments because, again, you're going to say this is a minority that's trying to challenge a majority undemocratically. I have to bring up another point with you. We have just a few minutes left because another thing that critics say is that Hungary's ruling party is almost now obsessed with this boogeyman scapegoat they've created in George Soros. They want to blame him for just about everything that is not in line with their conservative agenda. They believe it's a distraction and it's not fair. I'm just wanting to get your opinion on that.
Look, I think first to kind of follow up and put an end note to the last conversations, this is about strengthening workers' rights and strengthening individuals who want to work more, who want to be engaged in the workforce. This isn't some kind of slave law. This is 400 hours of overtime. The EU allows up to 416 hours. In the United States, you're allowed up to 40 hours per week of overtime.
But you get paid for that.
Well, of course you get paid for it. You get paid for this.
The argument here is the problem is the employers do not have to pay for up to 3 years because of this labor shortage.
That's not true at all. That is something that's been permeated throughout the media, and that's completely false. That's not true at all. You have to get paid. Employers should pay per month. If they're not paying per month, then the worker should sue.
Ava, now both panelists and the research done here disagrees with you, Jason.
It's
Jason
false.
doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Well, of course I do. I'm an international attorney. I understand you're a professor. I teach international law as well. Like it's patently false. You can see the book of the EU law is right behind me. Look.
Jason, the irony here is, too, that there's a massive labor shortage now that the government is trying to address. They're anti-immigration, so now they don't have enough people to actually do the jobs. to build up the industries that they're trying to build to strengthen the economy. And now they're trying to force these laws in order to help the economy and not punish companies that can't afford to pay the overtime that they need these workers to work.
There's not forcing these laws. Like, these laws were democratically elected in April. They've gone through the process constitutionally through Parliament to pass this law. There should be protests. If people do not like it, I agree with protests. Like, that should absolutely be happening. This should be more of a celebration of democracy because you have a vocal opposition that believes the side is right. But, like, that's part of a democracy. We're supposed to disagree in democracy.
Chiaroli, go ahead.
That's how it works.
I would also wish to celebrate democracy, but if a law is put forward without any consultation with the social partners, and this is about the world of labor, basic issues, then I wouldn't call it democracy. If there has been a demolition of social partnership institutions and downgrading, that's not part of democracy. Second, a very concrete point. Yes, you are right. 416 hours in the European Union, maximum overtime per year. But not within 3 years, 36 months of reference period. By the EU Working Time Directive of 2003, it is set as 6 months, and if social partners agree, can be extended to a maximum of 12. It is going to be 36. And we have already received over the past 2 days indications with concrete documents from our colleagues from medium-sized companies in Eastern Hungary that employers begin to negotiate and put through the 36 months and 400 hours, even before the law has been signed. And finally, the point is that if you are not able to consult on that, neither employers nor workers, then it's not democracy at all.
Okay. Ava, I'd actually asked Jason this question, but I'd like you to address it now. This issue with the ruling party using, in a sense, some say, critics say, this George Soros as this kind of scapegoat for every bit of dissent that seems to be happening in Hungary. Where is it coming from, and what do you make of it? If you don't have an opinion on it either way, then I can let Chiaroli address it.
Yeah, let him.
Go ahead, Chiaroli.
Well, we see all around in billboards, all around the country, on our taxpayer money, someone is being made scapegoat. I don't know whether a scapegoat or not. Those who do it have been part of Soros Foundation's support. On the other hand, I can also tell you, since I've been a long time in the trade union movement, I remember back early 90s when we wanted to get support for some of our projects, we were turned down by the Soros Foundations. So I'm not going to tell whether it's good or right. Definitely, as a multi-billionaire, would be mostly for trade unions.
Okay.
But if someone stands for democratic principles, that's something we have to celebrate.
Okay, Jason, go ahead.
Look, I just think that if you want to follow the money, that's where it should lead you. Look, I don't really know either way. You know, Mr. Soros is a billionaire. He certainly has organizations that he's funded that have been pervasive in these protest movements all around the world. But whether or not he's directing as some type of a boogeyman behind the scenes, I don't know. That seems like a lot of involvement for someone who's a billionaire. But there is money that is being funneled into these organizations, and that's just the truth of it. So if you want to know who's behind it, just follow the money.
Okay, Jason, I'm going to have to give you the last word because unfortunately we're out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us.
Our girls and women don't have any immunity inside our country because there is no rule of law. There is injustice and corruption within the government, and we suffer continuously from this lawlessness.
Well, life under Taliban rule in Afghanistan was brutal, and it still is in parts of the country that they control. If you're a woman, it's even worse. The nation is one of the lowest ranked on the Gender Inequality Index. Almost 90% of Afghan women have experienced some form of abuse, and many live with constant fear. But there are those who've been fighting for women's rights, and for some, it's almost cost them their lives. Well, Marzia Babakarhail is one of those women. She was forced to flee Afghanistan after the Taliban made an attempt on her life, and she joins us now from Manchester in the United Kingdom. Thanks so much for speaking to us, Marzia. Your work fighting for women's rights in Afghanistan very unfortunately gained the attention of the Taliban a decade ago. Tell us what happened to you and why it pushed you to flee your home country.
Thank you very much for having me. Because I was worked as a judge in Afghanistan in the family court, and I realized the injustice around women in the court. So I decided to, as a human being, as a woman, to support women in Afghanistan, especially in the court. And I established a women organization. It's called the WACO, that stands for Afghan Women Social and Cultural Organization. And I start to bring changes in women's life in Afghanistan and empowering women. So that all the job I have done for women, that was deeply offended the Taliban. That was the reason, they against with me.
Okay, and what did they do to you? Did they just threaten you, or did they outright attack you?
First time when they was in power in my town, Hungary, they come in my house. They came and they was searched on me, and they broke our door. They insult my mother and my family, and I was hiding in the back door. And we decided to move to Pakistan. And I went to Pakistan in 1998, and after I established a school for Afghan refugees in Pakistan, and I start again to fighting for women's rights and for human rights in Pakistan. That was the reason they bring me again, and the Taliban attention, so they hit me by car, and they put me, I was nearly die. So I was in hospital for 6 months. And one day I decided to leave because I attended, international conferences for my, throughout my job. That was of not, that all the thing I did, it was not the way the Taliban want from women in Afghanistan.
Right. Marzia, can you take us back to your mindset in late 2001 when the Taliban was first toppled and a new government was installed in Afghanistan? How hopeful were you then that things would change dramatically for women in your country?
Oh, that time was the most great time for women in Afghanistan. That bring hope for everybody, especially women, because the Taliban was just against with women in freedom. The thing they did in Afghanistan to close the schools, they close all the social activity for women. That time was the most great time for women in Afghanistan.
And then how does it compare to how you feel today, especially hearing that the government in Afghanistan is looking to negotiate with the Taliban, as if to legitimize the Taliban again as a political party?
I'm hoping, because I'm very involved with women's activists in Afghanistan, we have a hope to bring peace in Afghanistan if this project is worked.
How so? What's this project, and how do you think it would be powerful enough to combat the Taliban and its influence?
Because the government, they're trying to bring peace. Also, some people is fed up with the situation, they can't cope more to see every places people bomb blast and people dying. So it will be a good news for Afghanistan if this program will be worked in the positive way.
You say if it works in a positive way. So tell us what you want to see happen.
I want to be, I want peace in Afghanistan. And because now I'm not there, and I know some of women, they are involved in this process. And the women, they are involved in this process. They are very activist, and they are thinking about future of our country and the future of women. I'm very hopeful for the future.
And what are you doing now in the United Kingdom then to contribute to this? What's your work about?
When I came in this country, I start my life, a new chapter of my life. I came with no English. I cannot speak one word of English, but I bring my experience, my language skills, and I joined Oldham College to learn English. The first step I did, and after I start working as a caseworker with my local MP, Debbie Ibrahims. She is the MP for Oldham East and Saddleworth. And also I'm helping asylum seekers and refugees voluntarily, and I'm trying to bring big changes in asylum seeker and refugee life.
Do you hope to get back to Afghanistan one day?
I'm hoping to go back to Afghanistan one day. Yes, it is. Yes, really I want.
You feel there's still work for you to do there, huh?
Yes, you know, because all my life, from 1994, I established my organization and to empower women. I'm hoping one day I go back and work for women in Afghanistan.
Okay, Marzia Babakar Khail, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, violence threatens the upcoming election in the Democratic Republic of Congo. How will the DRC pick its first new leader in almost 20 years? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.